I found out what my wife's been hiding every night. Every night, my wife sneaks out of bed to watch something I never expected. After confronting her, our entire world shifted and nothing will ever be the same again. Let me introduce myself. I'm 38 years old, and my wife, Emily, is 37. She's everything to me, gorgeous, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes that caught my heart when we were teenagers. We've been inseparable since high school, building a life that feels as solid as a foundation we've worked on together for years. Married for more than a decade, we share a love that's seen us through thick and thin. Trust was never an issue between us. We were partners in every sense of the word. Our life was, by all accounts, pretty ordinary. We lived in a cozy house out in the countryside, surrounded by peace and quiet. I own a construction business, and Emily handles the accounts. Our days were filled with work, the occasional Luke Bryan concert, Friday night outings, and church on Sundays. Normal stuff. We laughed, loved, and lived in a routine that made sense. Or so I thought. About a week ago, I noticed something odd. One night, I woke up and saw Emily slipping out of bed. At first, it didn't strike me as unusual. People wake up at night to use the bathroom, grab a snack, or check something for work. She shuffled out of the room, slipping into her fuzzy slippers, and disappeared down the hall. The clock read a little after midnight. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. The next morning, though, she looked exhausted. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hands, staring into space. She's a light sleeper, and I figured maybe she'd had a restless night. When I asked, she brushed it off with a tired smile and a vague comment about being too fried to sleep well. I didn't push her. Emily's always been a bit reserved about her feelings. I kissed her cheek, gave her a gentle hug, and got ready for my day. But something about her reaction stayed with me, a faint unease I couldn't shake. The following night, the same thing happened. Just after midnight, Emily got up and left the bedroom. This time, curiosity got the better of me. I got out of bed and quietly followed her. She headed straight for the basement, where our computers were set up. Emily usually handled late-night emails or payroll checks there if something nagged at her. I stayed at the top of the stairs, not wanting to startle her, and watched as she sat at her desk, her feet tucked under her, illuminated by the pale glow of the monitor. That's when I saw it. Spicy videos. Not just any spicy stuff, but something rough and intense. The kind of content that seemed so far from the Emily I knew. She sat there, motionless, staring at the screen, her expression impossible to read. I froze. It wasn't the spicy videos itself that shocked me. We've all been there, right? What startled me was how out of character it seemed for her. I debated saying something, but it felt intrusive. Everyone deserves their privacy, I told myself, even in a marriage. So, I crept back to bed, leaving her to her midnight ritual. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, my mind running wild with questions. The next morning, Emily was at the table again, coffee in hand, looking even worse than before. I asked if she was okay, and she gave me the same vague reassurance as the previous day. I didn't mention what I'd seen. Instead, I carried the weight of my confusion into the day, trying to make sense of it on my own. By the third night, the unease was too much to ignore. Emily slipped out of bed at the same time, and once again, I followed. She sat in the same spot, watching the same kind of content. This time, though, she seemed frozen, almost entranced. I lingered longer, torn between the urge to intervene and the fear of crossing a boundary. Eventually, I returned to bed, unable to shake the image of her sitting there in the dim light of the monitor. That morning, the distance between us was palpable. Emily looked drained, jittery, and distant. I felt helpless, unsure of how to bridge the gap that was forming between us. The Emily I knew seemed to be slipping away, and I didn't know why. Whatever was happening, it felt bigger than I could handle alone. I decided to take a different approach. If Emily wasn't ready to talk, maybe I could find a way to bring it up indirectly. That evening, after dinner, we settled on the couch like we always did. She scrolled through her phone while I half-watched some reality show, my mind racing. During my lunch break earlier that day, I'd stumbled across something that felt like a good icebreaker. A quirky Amazon listing for fuzzy handcuffs and a matching red ball gag. I opened the page and casually leaned over to show her. "What do you think of this? Thought it might spice things up?" I chuckled, trying to keep it light. Her reaction blindsided me. Her face twisted in a mix of anger and embarrassment, and she swatted my phone out of my hand. "What the hell is wrong with you? That's disgusting. You're disgusting," she snapped. I was stunned. Emily had never spoken to me like that. My attempt to ease into the conversation had clearly backfired. The hurt in her voice and the harshness of her words left me speechless. I stammered an apology, feeling like I'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. She stormed off, leaving me sitting there, reeling. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. Why had she reacted so strongly? Was it shame? Embarrassment? Something else entirely? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. Emily was grappling with something she couldn't share, and it was tearing her apart. Once again, just after midnight, she got up and left the room. This time, I didn't follow immediately. I stayed in bed, debating whether I should intervene or let her have her space. After a few minutes, curiosity won out. I slipped out of bed and quietly made my way to the basement. As I reached the stairs, the familiar glow of the monitor greeted me. Emily sat in the same position, her feet tucked under her, staring at the screen, but something about her posture felt different this time. More rigid, almost as if she were frozen in place. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound. The audio from the computer was faint but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the usual sounds of pleasure. It was something darker, more unsettling. A woman's screams of pain. "Emily?" I called out softly, my voice trembling. She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. Her eyes were glued to the screen, and tears streamed down her face. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart raced as I approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She felt cold, unresponsive, like a statue. The video on the screen was horrifying. A blindfolded woman was being brutalized by masked men, her body a canvas of bruises and blood. My stomach turned as I tried to process what I was seeing. "Emily, we need to turn this off," I said, reaching for the mouse. But the cursor wouldn't move. I fumbled with the monitor's power button, but nothing happened. Panic set in as I yanked at the power cord, finally plunging the room into darkness. Emily collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Why is it always me?" she muttered, her voice filled with despair. I held her tightly, unsure of what to say or do. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything I could comprehend. After the harrowing events of that night, I knew we couldn't keep going like this. Emily's breakdown had shaken me to my core, and I realized that whatever she was experiencing, it wasn't something she could face alone. The next morning, she looked even worse. Her usual coffee routine had been replaced by staring blankly out the window, her face pale and drawn. I sat beside her, reaching for her hand. "Emily, we need to talk. Please tell me what's going on. I'm worried about you." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward me before quickly looking away. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me," I urged gently. "Whatever it is, we can face it together. But I can't help you if I don't understand." She sighed, her shoulders trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. It's not just a video. It's me. I see myself in it, every time. And I can't look away." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to rationalize what she was saying, but nothing made sense. "Emily, what do you mean it's you? Like, it looks like you?" She nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "It's me. Every time. They're hurting me. And I can't stop watching." I didn't know what to say. My rational mind struggled to process her confession, but her terror was unmistakable. Have you told anyone else about this? Maybe a doctor or—" "No," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I can't. They'll think I'm crazy. Maybe I am." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed. "You're not crazy, Emily. We'll figure this out. I'll help you. You're not alone in this." That day, I stayed home from work, unwilling to leave her side. We didn't talk much, but I stayed close, doing everything I could to make her feel safe. As night fell, my anxiety grew. I didn't want to relive the nightmare of the previous nights, but I knew it was inevitable. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop on its own. Around midnight, I stayed awake, watching Emily as she slept fitfully beside me. When she stirred and sat up, I followed her again, my heart pounding. This time, I was determined to confront whatever was tormenting her head-on. I wouldn't let her face it alone. This time, I was prepared to go further. As Emily shuffled down the hall and into the basement, I steeled myself for what was to come. I waited just long enough for her to settle in before quietly following. My steps were slow and deliberate, each one feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the landing, I saw her sitting in the glow of the monitor, her back rigid and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The audio hit me first. It wasn't just the cries of pain. There were voices, low and menacing, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. The screen showed the same horrific scene, but this time it was clearer, more vivid. The woman on the screen. It was unmistakably Emily. The same blonde hair, the same delicate features, even the small birthmark on her shoulder. My stomach churned as I took in the scene. The men in the masks moved with calculated cruelty, their shadows stretching long across the floor. "Emily," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes unblinking as tears streamed down her face. "Emily, we have to stop this." I moved closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the mouse. But as before, it wouldn't move. The cursor remained frozen, and the monitor's power button was unresponsive. Desperation surged within me as I fumbled for the power cord. Yanking it free, the room plunged into darkness, but the screams, they didn't stop. Emily let out a choked sob, collapsing onto the desk. "Why can't it stop?" she cried. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her as tightly as I could. "Why is it always me?" "It's not you," I whispered, though even as I said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. What if it was her? What if this wasn't just some twisted coincidence? We sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, her sobs eventually subsiding into quiet sniffles. I didn't let go, afraid that if I did, she might disappear into the nightmare that had taken hold of her. Finally, I helped her upstairs, guiding her back to bed. She fell into a restless sleep, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next day, I made a decision. We couldn't keep living like this. Whatever was happening, we needed help. I started researching, looking for answers, anything that could explain what was going on. But the more I searched, the more questions I uncovered. There were stories, rumors of cursed videos, and dark web horrors, but nothing concrete, nothing that could help us. That night, I resolved to stay by Emily's side, no matter what. If she got up again, I'd be there. And if the nightmare returned, I'd face it with her. Together, we'd find a way to end this. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Emily stirred beside me. I waited for her to rise, her movements slow and deliberate, like a sleepwalker trapped in a dream. I followed her as she made her way to the basement, my determination solidified. Whatever was down there, I would face it with her. When we reached the basement, the monitor flickered on by itself. The room was bathed in its eerie glow before Emily even touched the mouse. Her hands trembled as she sat down, her body stiff with dread. I stood behind her, my heart racing as the familiar scene unfolded. The masked men, the screams, the blood. It was all the same. But this time, something was different. The woman on the screen wasn't just Emily. It was her, but it was also me. My reflection stared back at me from the screen, bloodied and bruised, pleading for help. My stomach dropped as I realized the horrifying truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't just tormenting Emily. It was coming for me too. "Emily," I whispered, my voice shaking, "we have to stop this. Now." She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with fear. "How?" she choked out. "It won't stop. I've tried everything." Desperation clawed at me as I grabbed the monitor and yanked it from the desk. Sparks flew as the cords tore free, and I hurled it to the ground, shattering the screen. For a moment, the room was silent. Emily clung to me, her breathing ragged, as we stood in the darkness. But then, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the room. It didn't come from the broken monitor. It came from everywhere. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe around us. My grip on Emily tightened as a voice, deep and distorted, filled the room. "You can't escape," it growled. "This is only the beginning." The laughter grew louder, and the walls seemed to close in. Emily screamed, burying her face in my chest, and I held her as tightly as I could. My mind raced, searching for a way out. But there was nothing. We were trapped. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The basement was silent once more, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. I looked down at Emily, her face pale and tear-streaked, and knew that this wasn't over. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to let us go so easily. We left the basement that night, too afraid to return. I called in sick to work the next day, spending every moment by Emily's side. The monitor was gone, but the fear lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. I started looking for help, psychics, paranormal investigators, anyone who might have answers. But deep down, I knew the truth. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just haunting us. It was a part of us now, and no matter where we went or what we did, it would follow. We were no longer alone in our home, and we might never be again.